Scholars of Islam today are infinitely more sensitive to the problems that Said called attention to than they were 2 generations ago. So he has won in that sense. Sometimes I think that he has won too much because scholars uh, need to be. Certainly, you cannot study a religion that is not your own without any sympathy.
Mhm.
You need to be able to empathize with people whom you don't know, who are not close people. But you cannot be a good scholar without criticism. You need also some kind of distance and criticism. How do you balance the closeness and distance and sympathy and criticism is very tricky, is a very tricky business. But you have to do it. Otherwise, if you just embrace the people you study or the religions you study, you don't have the critical distance that permits you to see what went wrong when.
Mm.
Because in all cultures, in all religions, in history, things go wrong more easily than they go right. And the role of the scholar is to find out what happens. Not only, I mean, comparative religion is not interfaith.
Peace, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Real Talk Podcast. I'm Tehran, and as always, I'm joined by my brilliant co-host Roxana. In this episode, we are thrilled to welcome back Dr. Guy Strumza, the Martin Buber Professor Emeritus of Comparative Religion at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and Emeritus Professor of the Study of Abrahamic Religions at the University of Oxford, where he is also an Emeritus Fellow of Lady Margaret Hall. Dr. Strumza is the author of several influential works, including two that we'll be speaking about today: A New Science, The Discovery of Religion in the Age of Reason, and The Idea of Semitic Monotheism, which provide fascinating insights into the origins of religious studies and the complex legacy of Orientalism. And when it comes to Orientalism, instead of focusing solely on the critiques popularized by Edward Said, we're asking a bold question. Could there be another side to Orientalism, one that contributed positively to the study of religion and culture? So let's get to it. To start, let's define what we're talking about. Orientalism, as famously critiqued by Edward Said, refers to the way Western scholars historically approach the study of the Orient. Said often castigated these studies for being deeply intertwined with power and domination, done through a colonial and Eurocentric lens. But Professor Strumza's work offers a different perspective. He shows how early European scholars laid the groundwork for modern religious studies and built a framework where religion was understood as a universal human phenomenon. Which leads to our first question. Professor Strumza, in A New Science, you discuss how these early European scholars began to approach religion as a universal human phenomenon. What prompted this shift, and how did it influence the way religion had been studied previously?
Thank you very much, Teron. I'll say a few things about how I was brought to work on these questions. That was a long time ago, but I started my career as a historian of religion in the Mediterranean and the Near East in late antiquity. Uh, Mainly Christianity, dualist trends such as Gnosticism, Manichaeism, Judaism, up to Islam, and also the philosophical and religious trends in the pagan or non-monotheistic world. That's how I started. But I was teaching in a department of comparative religion, and I thought that any scholar at some point in her or his career should also reflect in the humanities, certainly in the sciences it's less true, but should reflect on the epistemology of the field. What are the questions we ask? What does it mean? What does it entail? Not only what is officially asked and openly asked, but what is not only explicit but also implicit in the kinds of questions you ask. For instance, I'm Jewish, but we are all living in a Christian cultural realm, in a sense, Christian or post-Christian, but our conceptions were framed by centuries and centuries of intellectual history, which was Christian intellectual history in many ways. And often we don't realize that we are the inheritors of such a mind frame. And so, this is now well known, but it has been well known only in the last generation. And the question is, what does it mean really when we say, for instance, religion? When we say or we write or we think about religion, implicitly our conceptions are Christian conceptions of what religion is, what you do and what you believe, the importance of faith, and so on. It's not true. Faith, for instance, does not necessarily exist in Roman religion or in Greek religion. And Greek religion has been very important, especially in England, in the Cambridge ritualists in the last 19th century, to start or kickstart the modern study of religion. So we know now that we have to reflect and ask questions of epistemology. I said it's more true for the humanities than it is for the sciences because the history of our fields depends very much on such problems. If you're a physicist, it should not matter to you what physics was like in the 12th century or in the 16th century. When you work on your equations today, it doesn't make a difference. If you have a curious mind, you may want to know how Galilei thought, but it's something else. It's history of science. In the humanities, history of scholarship or of science is part of what we're doing. Now, not everybody does that. That's fine. Some do, and I belong to those who do. So at some point, I wanted to reflect. I was not teaching in a department in a faculty of theology, specialist of early Christian thought or literature. I was teaching in a department of comparative religion, and I wanted to reflect on how did the concept comparative religion develop? What does it mean to study religion? And my way of asking these questions is to ask them through history, through the history of the discipline. So that's how I started. I was curious, I was interested, I enjoyed doing what I was doing. And since then, so that's in the last 30 years approximately, I've been working both on late antiquity and on early modern, then later 19th century, and also 20th century study of religion. Two different fields. I try to keep them together. I just finished manuscript of a book that has been accepted for publication by Oxford University Press, which is called The Dynamics of Religion, Dynamics of Monotheism in Late Antiquity. And I'm sending the book, the final manuscript, to Oxford next week, basically. So it will appear within 6 months, I imagine. And now, again, I decide to move back to the history of the discipline. And maybe we'll talk about that later, what I want to do now.
Okay.
So I come back to your question. What did I want to do in this first of my books? The Discovery of Religion in the Age of Reason. A New Science. Now, let's talk about the title. A New Science is, of course, a smile to Giambattista Vico, who wrote in the 17th century in Naples, La Scienza Nuova, the new science. And for him, it was the new science was the science of what he called mythology, and in a sense, religion. Except that for him, he didn't want to get into trouble with the Catholic Church, so he said, there's no mythology in the Hebrew Bible, and of course not in the New Testament. So I'm talking only about pagan religions, and I can freely say what I want to say when I say I don't touch Christian theology, so you should not attack me. So Vico is a man of the generation of the people I studied. It's the origins of the modern study of religion, and we can look at the footnotes of Vico. We can see what he had in his library, basically. And many of the texts he quotes and the things he had in his library are the scholars I'm studying in this first book, New Science. So early modern, when I say Age of Reason, the Age of Reason is two things in contemporary speech. It's the 17th century with the philosophers such as Descartes, Leibniz, and Spinoza, the rationalists, so the Age of Reason, but the Age of Reason extends to the French Revolution. The Enlightenment is also part of the Age of Reason. And in this book, actually, I don't deal with the 17th century, but I mean the Age of Reason in the very broad sense, from the 16th century to the 18th century. Now, coming back to the title, the discovery of religion. Discovery refers to the great discoveries. At the time, Europeans, Spaniards and Italians mainly, discover America and discover the East through all around Africa, Cape of Good Hope, India, China, and Japan, basically. And you have, so this is the discovery of the world in the late 15th throughout the 16th century. Now, these people are Christians. Their kings are also Christians, but they're more interested in gold. Their churches are interested in converting people. And so you have so you have missionaries sent to Central America, to Mexico of today, to Peru, to Quebec, New France, and then New England, India, and China. Missionaries sent to the Muslim world started earlier in the Middle Ages because it was through the Mediterranean. You didn't need the great discoveries for that.
And these were mostly Catholics.
Yes, of course. That's before they are Protestants.
Oh, yeah, before the Protestant Revolution.
When the Protestants start, they don't have the energies to convert other people. They're fighting the Catholics. Yeah. So the missionaries, Dominicans, Jesuits, Franciscans mainly, they go places. Some are radical Christians, and they think that anyone who is not baptized will burn in hell and so on. And some of them, many of them, think that it still remains to be proven that the new people we discover are humans.
Mm.
Are they really, do they have a soul? Do the Indians, the American Indians, yes, do they have a soul? The Aztecs or the Incas? And these are questions that are debated seriously in universities in Salamanca or in Oxford or elsewhere. But eventually they get convinced that these are human beings, and therefore they will burn in hell if they don't convert. And so we'd better try to convert them. That's our task. In order to convert them, force can be used, but it's not a good idea. Augustine already in the 5th century had said that you should not force people into accepting the faith. I mean, it doesn't mean it. It wouldn't mean anything. So you have to convince them. What does it mean to convince people? Either you teach them your language or you learn their language. You have to speak to them. So some among the missionaries learn the languages of the people they meet, be it Chinese, Japanese, Tamil in South India, or Inca language. They make a very serious intellectual effort to learn these languages. Some manage to do it. So you can speak to them. You can translate the New Testament into these languages. Sometimes you have to ask yourself, how do I translate the name God into Chinese, for instance? It doesn't exist. Heaven, and that's the solution that is found. And then these people, some of them, the most interesting among these missionaries, become anthropologists. They didn't plan it as a career. They are churchmen. But in order to understand the people they meet, they have to be social anthropologists to understand them, not only to speak their language, but to know what it means, to know who are their gods. And you keep asking, and you become also scholars of comparative religion. They don't, of course, they don't have the Bible, they don't believe in the Hebrew God, they don't believe in the Christian Son of God, they don't, but they have beliefs. They have religious rituals. They burn incense, they open the heart of their prisoners and they offer to their gods or whatever. They do things. They have temples. What are these temples? They look at the Aztecs temples, for instance, the Spaniards, because they go to Mexico. How do they call these temples? They call them mezquitas, that is to say, mosques.
Yeah.
Because that's what they know, that the bad guys have mosques. You know, the bad guys are the Muslims. In Spain, the enemy is the Muslim, even when it's not there anymore, but it's in the mind. In the mind, the Muslim is the non-Christian. So they have mosques. That's how they call the pyramids of Mexico.
Because that was the only framework within which they could understand the new peoples and their religions that they were coming across, which I imagine was a total shock to their Christian sensibilities.
Exactly. You can understand new ideas or peoples or behaviors or beliefs only through the mental frames that you have in your brain. You translate in order to learn their language, you also translate into your own language. And some among these people, some among these missionaries become also, they start writing. They start looking at what they're doing and they write reports and they become our first real anthropologists since Herodotus. Of course. Herodotus did that also, but that's in a new world. So you have the great discoveries, the missionaries who become anthropologists and describe, they can be interested. Some become linguists because they are interested in the linguistics. Some who want to convert these people are interested in their religion and they write down and they analyze the religion of the Indians of South India, of the Chinese, of the Japanese. Then you have something else that happens in early modern Europe, and it is the Renaissance. The Renaissance, the discovery of Greece and Rome, the rediscovery of classical literature,
Like Homer?
pagan, of course, as Christians rediscover, and they get enamored with Greek and Roman literature, and they get enamored with a non-Christian world. They remain Christians, but most of them really are honestly Christians. But they have a very strong interest in these other worlds, and they become philologists. They print these books. They correct, Erasmus is the big name. We're not interested in mentioning the names of these people there, but what is interesting is that they learn to respect texts coming from different civilizations, from different religions, from different languages. They learn to learn languages, to print books, to respect them, to try to understand them, not as anthropologists, but as philologists. That's the second of the trends that happens in the Age of Reason that are relevant to my field. Of course, many other things happen. The third one is the wars of religion in Europe from the 16th century in Western Europe between Catholics and Protestants. Christians massacre one another brutally for decades. And the intellectuals, and they are all males, of course, at the time. No women are able to do these things. These intellectuals, be they Catholics or Protestants, they look at this collective mass massacre in Europe with very sad eyes. They're peoples. It doesn't matter what is their camp, but they understand that they live in times of madness. As I'm sorry to say, we have to understand now, but that's another topic. That they live in times of madness, and even when it doesn't affect really their religion, their beliefs. No, from my point of view, I've checked to what extent these people remain Christians. I mean, you may, if you are a Christian or Muslim or Jew or Buddhist and you see your co-religionists massacring one another or other people, you may come to you may realize that religion is not a very good thing, and I don't want to have much to do with it.
You start having a crisis of faith.
Yeah, But these people actually remained good Catholics or good Protestants, the great majority of them. But with a twist, they remain good Catholics or Protestants, but enlightened, not fanatics. Enlightened, and therefore they retained a distance vis-à-vis Christianity. The brutality of the wars of religion is the third element that changes the mentality. I'm a good Catholic or I'm a good Protestant, and the Protestants were better than the Catholics in philology. The Catholics were the anthropologists and the Protestants were the philologists. I'm a bit exaggerating, but to a great extent, that's what we had at the time. And they developed some kind of distance, internal distance vis-à-vis their own faith. I'm a Christian, but I'm not going to swallow anything that people do or say in the name of Christianity. There is also such a thing as bad religion and bad Christianity. And actually, if I look, they say, if I look at the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Empire, so what for them was the Muslim world was mainly the Ottoman Empire for Christians, European Christians, because it was next door. And look at them, these Muslims. Their prophet may be a false prophet, but their religion is much better than ours because they've learned tolerance. And so this, you can be a Christian and you can be a Jew and you can be a Shiite within a Sunni empire. This is not true anymore nowadays, but alas, but at the time, the Christian European world was much less tolerant than the Muslim world. And so they learn what I can call relativism. Religions are relative. Truth, even if I still believe that Jesus Christ is my savior and so on, but I'm not going to swallow everything that is said in the name of Jesus Christ by this church or by that church. So these three elements, I recapitulate, these three elements. First, the discovery of new worlds, which had been completely unknown from Europeans. The philology, learning to learn languages, difficult new languages, and to publish texts and to read texts critically and carefully and respectfully. Third thing, some kind of interior distance vis-à-vis Christianity. Permit them to study religions together. Dead religions as well as living religions. Okay.
And would you say that this distancing away from Christianity by its scholars or by some of its adherents, would you say this was the beginning of the secularizing of religious studies or the study of religion? Because you argue that early scholars of religion helped secularize the field by separating it from theology. Was this secularization a deliberate shift or more of an unintended consequence of early modern scholarship?
It's a very good question, and the full answer is long, complicated, and mixed. But in a sense, at first, it's an unintended consequence. At first, you learn, but it's also that the start of new universities, you learn to get away from theology. Theology is Christian theology, and what you're doing is something that it starts in theological faculties, but more and more, and that goes up to the 19th century or the 20th century, And more, it's something different. Look, when in 2009, I was appointed the first professor for the study of the Abrahamic religions at the University of Oxford in the Faculty of Theology. I was also the first Jewish professor of theology at Oxford.
Mm.
Until then, it was only Christian theology. But I was not doing theology. I was doing the comparative study of religion. And 3 years later, the faculty changed its name into the Faculty of Theology and Religion, just as Cambridge Faculty of Theology became Faculty of Divinity. So you find a word that is more inclusive than theology, which is only Christian. But let's not speak about the 20th century. Still in our period, 16th, 17th, 18th century, the real argumentation against the church, against Christianity, starts in earnest under the Enlightenment. In France, not only in France, Hume in Scotland, but you have people who start wanting to remain outside, to think in a non-Christian way, and to think about humanity and about history in a non-Christian way, and about religion in a non-Christian way. That's Hume, for instance, David Hume.
And in particular, for the Enlightenment period, how did the sort of idea of the rejection of revelation or the idea of a natural religion, how did this affect comparative religious studies, and in particular, how Europeans interacted with Islam?
Well, it's the idea of speaking of natural religion. And religion, I mean, they've realized now, by the time David Hume writes, he knows that religion is a phenomenon much wider than Christianity in the world geographically and historically. Christianity is one among many religions. It's not even the last one, because Islam comes after Christianity. For the Muslims, of course, the later the better, until, for all religions, the later the better, until us. Then what comes later is degeneration, of course. That's true for Christianity, and that's true for Islam. Islam doesn't suffer later reinterpretations and dubs them heresies. For the Christians, for the Christian fathers, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th century, Judaism is, look, Jews and Muslims, like Christians, believe in one God. But so they are part of the family, the Abrahamic religions, but they are false religions. Only Christianity is the true religion, and only my interpretation of Christianity, says every king and every bishop, is the correct interpretation. Others are heretics. Judaism is the first heresy. Judaism because the world was born Christian, Adam, and then Abraham, and then Jesus Christ, and what other people misinterpret. Moses gives the Jews, the Hebrews or the Jews give have a view of revelation that is incomplete. It's not false, but it's incomplete. The last heresy, the worst heresy of all, is Islam, because Muhammad was a false prophet. So the Christians navigate between the first heresy and the last heresy.
And
Does that answer your question, Roxana?
yeah,
Yeah,
To some
absolutely.
extent. To some
Yeah.
extent. I mean, we could talk for days, of course.
Yeah.
Okay.
and one of the key points in A New Science is that the early study of religion emerged from Europe's engagement with Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, and Buddhism, as you've already mentioned, during the early modern period. While Edward Said might emphasize how this reinforced colonial control, can you elaborate how this engagement with these various religions expanded the intellectual horizons of European scholars?
I'm glad that we finally get to Edward Said. I will say I never met him, but I read many of his writings, and like him, I'm not a scholar of literature, but I'm very interested. I love literature. I'm very interested. So I understand his approach. Uh, he has been criticized so much that I don't want to add my own criticism. I don't think that, I would only repeat what so many people have done. He has done something very important. He has changed our discourse on European, or I mean, he was American and so on. And I want to add that Edward Said was the most famous Palestinian intellectual. I'm an Israeli citizen, and I'm an Israeli citizen who has much sympathy for the Palestinians' plight, and I'm very happy that to deal with somebody like Edward Said. I've great respect for him. I think that I don't agree with. Yeah,
And mind you, I also agree. It's nothing to take away. I'm not trying to take anything away from Edward Said. I've read some of his writings as well. He seemed to be a fine scholar, and people spoke very well of him. And we're not going to reiterate all of the critiques that are out there about him, but the legacy of his book, Orientalism, has been unescapable, especially when you talk about the study of religion within the Western context, which is why, he's such a figure that you kind of always have to mention when you describe these things.
of course.
I was just hoping that, with your work, I mean, with your work you do, you provide a wider view or another view of the scholarship that he critiques. So,
Yes, thank you. No, I'm retired now. I've been retired for many years, and since I like retirement so much, I retired twice, first from Jerusalem, then from Oxford. But from time to time, I'm being asked to speak to students. And this week, I spoke to students in a seminar on the Abrahamic religions at the Hebrew University, organized by two young colleagues. And I proposed the topic intimate enemies, uh, the place of Judaism and Islam in European consciousness. And what I meant is that European consciousness is to a great extent Christian or post-Christian, culturally Christian consciousness, and Judaism and Islam together should be seen as intimate enemies, and also in the history of Europe. But Edward Said, what he did for Orientalism, he was interested in Islam and the Arab world, legitimately. Orientalism was also interested in all the Orient, ancient Orient and east of Islam, so India and China and Japan principally. This he ignores, and the attitude, the consequences of his book, the conclusions of his book would be very different had he integrated also other areas of Orientalism. So in a sense, it's the title of his book is a very good title, but it's mistaken in a sense. It also leads into wrong. Now, there was what I didn't say until now. When I spoke about the Age of Reason, I ended with a more or less Enlightenment, French Revolution. After the French Revolution comes Romanticism and the 19th century. And for European countries, colonialism and imperialism. And the conquest of the world, but it's not only the conquest of the Muslim world, it's also the conquest of America, it's also the conquest of India by the French and the British. Then the British win, or the English at the time win, and the Raj, and so you also have a very important skewed perception of India precisely in British scholarship, but the best scholarship is British scholarship, but it's also a scholarship just related in an unbreakable way with the colonialism, the British colonialism in India, just as the earlier traditions, which I called anthropological traditions about other religions, were linked with Christian missionary movement. We don't choose our periods, and anyone in history at any point anywhere has a standpoint. You look at the world from where you are. You cannot look at the world from everywhere. And so, yes, Edward Said was very important. What he did about Islam, the skewed perception of Islam and of the Arabs. I mean, he deals with different things, and he's interested in literature and not only in scholarship. So it's a mixed bag in a way, but it's very true. What I think that where Said misses the point is that he forgets is what he doesn't say. It's not on what he says, it's on what he doesn't say. For instance, in order to, and that will be if I manage to write a new book, it will be on that precisely. Intimate enemies, Judaism and Islam in the mind of Europe. And Said did think a bit about the Jews. And he did write things, but I think that it goes together, and it's much more important. The link between Judaism and Islam in European consciousness is much more important than what Said thought, because he was interested in Arabs and Islam. For Christianity, the first polemics of Christianity is with Judaism, not with Islam. It starts before Islam comes. And then in European consciousness, Jews and Muslims are the false and the erring brothers, if you want, in a sense. And they think about them together. And Orientalism starts not with the study of Arabic, but with the study of Hebrew. And most people who study Arabic until 2 generations ago, everywhere in European universities, in Oxford, in Spain, in Germany, you first studied Hebrew, and then you studied Arabic. Then you may decide to become an Arabist, so you forget about the Hebrew, but the idea was, and it makes sense because they are both Semitic languages, that you study them together. And this here, I think Said misses the point. Moreover, he misses the point because he doesn't think, he mentions them sometimes, of the Jewish Orientalists in Europe, mainly in German-speaking or writing countries, Central Europe. And these Jewish Orientalists are very important in bringing in opening Europe to other religions and traditions. Islam first, and then India and China. They play a very important role, in the study of Islam, mainly in the German-speaking world. Jews start getting out of their ghettos and learn modern languages, I mean, intellectually, not only just to function on the marketplace, but learn modern culture and want to go to universities.
What on that, what prompted Jewish scholarship to become interested in Islam or the Arabic language or Muslims? Because,
That's exactly what I wanted to say.
okay, cool. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
So you have young Jewish intellectuals, let's say in Germany, in the mid-19th century. They received a good Jewish education, Hebrew at home, then, or in Jewish schools, then they want to go to the university. Universities will not accept them because they didn't study Greek and Latin.
Mm.
And they don't have, so in the sciences maybe, but not in the humanities, you need to have Greek and Latin. They won't accept them except for the Oriental faculties. Because the professors there, who are Christians, of course, realize that these people already know Hebrew and Aramaic very well. So they tell them, well, you just learn a bit Arabic and you can be students and you can get a degree in Semitic languages. So they learn, many of them learn just a bit Arabic, and then they get an academic degree, and then they can be officially rabbis because they have a degree from the university. But others get hooked. They love Arabic, and they decide to become scholars of Arabic language or literature or religion and so on. So, and in a sense, the Jewish scholars of Islam and then of Hinduism and of Chinese play a very important role. They're not the only ones, of course, but much more than their percentage in the population would imagine. And they consider themselves, look, Jews in Europe in the late 18th century or in the 19th century, they're not considered Germans or French. French, to an extent, gives them nationality, but certainly not German. There's no such thing as Germanian. They are, as Kant calls the Jews, says, the Palestinians living among us. Kant, they come from Palestine. They are an Oriental people, but they live among us, and we learn to, if they learn our language and our ways, and they learn how to put a tie decently, we'll accept them to an extent. And the Jews understand that they want to be accepted in European society and culture. In order to do so, they understand that they understand foreigners very well, because they themselves are foreigners to Christian Europe. And they have a better sense of how to present Islam or Hinduism to Europeans than many European Christians. You see, I mean, they consider themselves as a kind of bridge between Europe and the rest of the world and other cultures. In a sense, this is the argument I developed in my idea of Semitic monotheism, the rise and fall of a scholarly myth, because it is a scholarly myth, the idea of Semitic monotheism.
And actually, moving on to your book, The Idea of Semitic Monotheism, do you think that this concept helped foster a sense of unity amongst the traditions, or did it reinforce stereotypes about Semitic peoples? And how did this categorization of religions as Semitic or Aryan shape the study of religion and influence cultural hierarchies at the time?
Well, the 19th century starts with Romanticism, ends with colonialism and imperialism. At the same time, it is a century of disentanglement from Christianity, some ongoing secularization, if you want. It's never complete disentanglement, but it's less. You can circulate in more areas of life without being a Christian and without thinking in Christian terms than before. At the same time, the attitudes towards others becomes not tolerated.
Mm.
Because Christianity moves from being the true religion of Europe to being our common cultural capital, to use the terms of Bourdieu. The capital, the cultural capital of Europe is Christianity. And therefore, if you're not a Christian, you don't belong. You're not really a European. And there are very few, it's not that there are few Muslims in Europe. There are lots of Muslims. But in Central and Eastern Europe, not in Germany, not in France, not in England, not in Spain, not in Italy. And in many ways, in intellectual history of Europe starts with Britain to Germany, not further east. In some ways, it's wrong to say that, but and therefore, these are countries. It's a Europe with the consciousness of the presence of Jewish communities, but no Muslim communities. That Bosnia is Muslim, that Bulgaria is in many sense Muslim. In many ways, there are many Muslims. The Ottoman Empire and so on, they don't want to think about it. It's not really. So you have Jews within Europe, Muslims around Europe, and the development of radical attitudes of intolerance against Jews and Muslims. They are, for the Europeans, the Muslims, the Ottoman Empire is a threat. It's everything that we are not, and we are everything that they are not. We have progress, they are retarded, for instance.
So would you say in the 19th century, you see a decline in the attitudes towards Jews and Muslims, or the Oriental people that were being studied? Because it seems like in the 17th and 18th century, you kind of see an incline of positive attitudes. But how you kind of describe the way things were going in 19th century Oriental scholarship seems like there was kind of I don't want to say a decline in positive attitudes, but definitely things started to change along racial lines, which can create a bit of conflict.
I think that what was religious anti-Semitism, for instance, becomes a racial anti-Semitism in the 19th century. And at the end of the century, the Dreyfus affair in France, the last decade of the 19th century, the Jews are traitors. They are not true French. And Islam is a threat to progress. Europe is science, Europe is progress, Islam is an unenlightened religion, religion of shadows, and it's bad, it's dangerous, it's past, it's retarded. Judaism also, we knew is retarded, and now we don't suffer the Jews also as citizens. So there's an increase in radical non-religious attitudes to those two religions. And this is to some extent funneled through scholars.
Mm.
I'm thinking of German scholarship. I'm thinking of Renan in France. It's striking. Renan, by the way, has been accused of anti-Semitism. I've studied him a lot. He was a great scholar.
I mean, the term was created as a response to him, according to your book.
Yeah. But he was not an anti-Semite. He thought that he was not really, he thought that Judaism is less good a religion than Christianity. That's fine. It's not yet anti-Semitism. He was not against encouraging the Jews to go into French society at large and into the universities and so on. But the prejudices he didn't have against the Jews, he had against the Muslims. Or more precisely, since he didn't know Muslims, he didn't meet many Muslims in his life, but against Islam. Islam is a decadent religion for him, a religion which fights scientific progress and so on and so forth. This is not the case anymore for most scholars, I think, but it left a very strong imprint, and that's what I can say.
One thing you argue in your book is that concepts like Semitic monotheism sometimes undermined European exceptionalism by emphasizing the Middle Eastern roots of Christianity. Was this a counterbalance to these sorts of attitudes that you're describing at the moment?
Oh, I didn't get the question. Could you repeat it, please?
Sure, sorry. So you argue that concepts like Semitic monotheism in your book sometimes undermined sort of the European exceptionalism or differentiation from Judaism by emphasizing the Middle Eastern roots of Christianity.
Okay.
Could this be seen as like a counterbalance to Orientalist narratives about Islam and Judaism?
Yeah, you're quite right. The very concept of Semitic monotheism starts with, not with monotheism, but with Semitic. And Semitic is a term in linguistics. You have Indo-European languages, and it's with a certain form of grammar, and you have Semitic languages, Ethiopian, Hebrew, Arabic, Aramaic, with a very clear sense of grammatical structures. And to speak about Semitic languages is perfectly fine. There is such a thing. It became dangerous when you say there are Semitic languages. It means that they're spoken by Semitic peoples. So there are Indo-European languages, yes, Sanskrit, Iranian, Greek, up to German and English and Russian belong to the same family, and therefore the peoples belong to the same families. Families of people is what in the 19th century is called races. And therefore you have an Indo-European race or Aryan race, to use this the Sanskrit term, and you have Semitic races or the Semitic race. And if you have a race, then they have a religion. So you have Semitic religion versus Indo-European religion. Indo-European religion is polytheistic, like India, like Greece, many gods, very rich nature. And Semitic religion is monotheistic because it grows in the desert and there's nothing in the desert except you can think only about one thing, about one God. And so it's a very poor conception of God.
Yeah,
That's
nothing to
Renan.
inspire the imagination in the
Yeah,
desert.
exactly. That's Renan. Now, that's ridiculous. Most Semitic peoples, all Semitic peoples, except the Jews, were polytheists. Just like the Greeks and the Romans. I mean, there are some Greek philosophers like Plotinus who are monotheists, but the Greeks were polytheists. The Semitic peoples were polytheists also.
Right.
So the idea of Semitic monotheism is a myth that is constructed by Renan, I repeat, a great scholar. I have much respect for him, but I understand that he was a man of his times and lived and thought with mental frames of his time. And so for him, Christianity, and here is my answer to your question, Oksana, Christianity for him is Europe. Jesus was born in Palestine, but then the Roman emperors converted to Christianity. Christianity for 20 centuries is a European, a Western thing. Judaism and Islam are East, right? Belong to the East, to the Orient, but, and that's what Said never saw, there are two kinds of Orient. There is what I call, it's like cholesterol. You know, there's good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. The good Orient is the Orient of India. The newly discovered world of India, full of ideas and gods and so on. Splendid. The bad Orient is the simplistic Orient of the desert of the Semites. And actually, it fits with the trends of secularization, which means disentanglement from the Judeo-Christian tradition, from the biblical world. The Orient, the biblical Orient, biblical/Muslim Orient is close to us, but it's the bad Orient. The good Orient is the Orient who can dream about, and it's the Indian Orient, Indian or Chinese also. So that's so basically in the 19th century, you want Jews and Muslims in the East there, and we in Europe remain Christians. It didn't quite work this way, but that's where you have all connections between thinking about between religion, secularization, scholarship of religion, and imperialism. Everything happens at the same time, and you have reconstitutions of structures of the mind that until then were Christians and now are not Christian anymore, but implicitly remain Christian in some ways.
We spoke about the relativist approach that is used in modern religious studies today. I mean, how does a relativist approach to religion undermine Said's thesis in Orientalism?
I don't think it should undermine Said's thesis. Said's thesis should be expanded, actually, made more sophisticated and so on. It's true. I want to say two things. It should be, as I say, it's more complicated than what he thought. It's broader because he thought only about the Islam and not all kinds of Islam, Arab Islam.
Right.
Only 1 in 5 Muslims today is an Arab. Most Muslims don't belong to the Arab world. Look, 2 weeks ago, I was for the first time in Abu Dhabi. Flew from Tel Aviv, 3 hours flight, and I realized that it's also 3 hours flight from Tel Aviv to Mumbai. So it's equidistant. So if you are in Abu Dhabi, you speak Arabic, you are Muslims, you belong to the Arab world, but it's a very different kind of Arab world than the world of Egypt or Syria, where there are almost no non-Arabs. There are lots of Indians in Abu Dhabi, and my wife was invited to speak at a conference on wisdom at the Abrahamic Family House, which has together the same architecture, a mosque, a synagogue, and a church. And that's at the center of Abu Dhabi, and that's what the current Sheikh, Emir of Abu Dhabi wants to represent. And so you have very different conceptions of Islam. I think that Said's thesis should be broadened, and we should remember that although what he says is true, that scholars of Arabic and Islam came from a world that was in the 19th century strongly immersed in ideologies of dominance of Europe. Intellectual curiosity permits people, that's true in all cultures and in all times, intellectual curiosity permits people to get beyond their own culture.
To transcend.
Not totally, you never become God or a star from looking at the earth from firmament. But what is impressive in the history of Orientalism is the ability of some scholars, not all, not most, but some, the best, are able to go over and beyond their own traditional culture and develop some kind of respect and love, sometimes even infatuation, in cultures and religions which are not their own.
Which I feel is the part a lot of people are missing. I feel like a lot of people, when it comes to Orientalism, they're looking at the glass as if it's half full, but they don't see the curiosity that these people had, the transcending certain prejudices that they held. Even though, as you mentioned, they didn't completely rid themselves of these prejudices, it was a noble endeavor that they undertook to kind of rid the ones that they had gotten rid of. And yeah, I just feel like all of this is missed when discussions on Orientalism today. We're looking at it as if these people were totally bad, always within the context of colonialism or imperialism, which the argument can be made that Orientalism existed before imperialism and colonialism. You've described Orientalism as a product of its time, reflecting both its biases and intellectual ambitions. Given these complexities, how should modern scholars engage with this legacy without outright dismissing its contributions? Because I feel like the direction we're going in is like a lot of these contributions that the early Orientalists had laid, will soon be forgotten by people who hold certain ideologies that aim to kind of just destroy their legacy.
Well, what we have today is a globalized world. You have universities in Africa, you have universities in India, in China, in Japan, not only in Western Europe and the United States. And therefore, different people have different approaches. I was once in Kyoto in Japan, And there a very good Christian university called Doshisha University, and they have a religion department, and they study there Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and so on. I was interested, and I said, "Do you also study Buddhism?" Which is, the main religion in Japan. And they said, no, 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 we let the other universities do that. That was too much for them. So that was a bit, I smiled at that. But I think that in many ways, I gave a lecture less than a year ago at the University of Tokyo, which is an excellent university, and the perspective is very different on monotheism and polytheism. And so I think that let's say, what Said pointed out, very disturbing and serious facts. What he forgot to say is that a culture who is interested in other cultures, starting from a vicious point of view, for instance, you learn Pashto in order to conquer Afghanistan. It's not respectable to learn Pashto in order to conquer Afghanistan. But some of these soldiers in the American army or in the Russian army, I guess, who learned Pashto, some of them decided that actually it's a beautiful language and I want to study more and I want to read the literature. And some became scholars and wrote and fell in love with the Pashto people and the Pashto literature. So it's better than when nothing happens of
Definitely.
interest. When you have a culture where there is no interest in other cultures, it's not so good. That's what I can say.
Have you ever, do you think that that interest is mutual in the sense that, do you think that Christian and European cultures have been very interested in the East, but has that interest been reciprocated the other way around?
It's a very good question. I don't. The simple answer is that I don't know. I can't answer.
Bernard Lewis has a book.
My guesses.
Bernard Lewis has a book on this subject, how the Muslim world viewed Europe. I believe it.
About the Muslim world, in the Middle Ages, certainly the intellectual curiosity was among the Muslims and not among the Christians. Much more. In the contemporary world, in the 19th and 20th century, there were very few institutions of higher learning in the non-Western world. Today, this is not true anymore. So I think that it's the curiosity is worldwide now. It's done in many ways through lens that are lens of European and American thinkers. So if you want, in many ways, but people I saw in Japan and learned to disentangle themselves. Africa is either Muslim or Christian in many ways. So it's much harder because you choose your camp and you accept and you say, well, Christianity perceived itself for many years as European Christianity, but actually most Christians are non-Europeans today.
Right.
And so on.
And I believe Christian,
as you know, in the UK, most Anglicans live in Nigeria today.
I didn't know that. But I am aware that Christianity is growing, where it might be in somewhat decline in the West or Europe, America. It is growing elsewhere in the world where people wouldn't expect it. And I found that really interesting. But we only have a couple more questions for you, and these are more reflective, if you don't mind answering. How do you balance critiquing the biases of early Orientalist scholarship while appreciating their intellectual contributions? And do you think we need a new framework for studying religion and culture in today's interconnected world?
I can only answer through what I do. What I do in my society, in my city, which I saw in Abu Dhabi a compound of a church, a synagogue, and a mosque together, built with the same dimension. I could not dream of something like that being established in Jerusalem, which should be its most natural place. So what do I do? I'm retired from the university. I'm a member of the Israel Academy of Sciences and Humanities, also of the British Academy now. What I do here is that I organize a forum on the study of the Abrahamic religions, which for all university teachers in Israeli universities. I announced what I was doing. Those who are interested come, and they come a few times a year to Jerusalem. Israel is a small country. You can travel and back from Haifa or from Tel Aviv in maximum 2 hours. And we meet and we study together. They were trained as Arabists if they are Islamicists, as Judaists, or some in the study of Christianity, my former students and so on. And I teach them, I try to help them think about their field within a broader framework.
Mm.
I mean, they teach Islam. Most of them teach Islam, for instance, and I try to tell them that their articles, their books, and their teaching of students will be better if they also think of phenomena in Christianity, in Judaism, and vice versa. So that's what I do. I don't preach. I try to preach by example. I mean, that's what we're trying to do. But as you know, we live in terrible times. Okay.
Unfortunately. And,
Roxana wanted to ask something.
yeah.
I just wanted to ask if you were to respond to Edward Said's critique of Orientalism, how would you defend the contributions of early European scholars, and what advice would you give to students of Islam today who are trying to navigate this legacy while still advancing the field of comparative religion?
Yeah, I think that to a great extent, Said has been successful, especially among students of Islam. Scholars of Islam today are infinitely more sensitive to the problems that Said called attention to than they were 2 generations ago. So he has won in that sense. Sometimes I think that he has won too much because scholars need to be, certainly you cannot study a religion that is not your own without any sympathy.
Mm-hmm.
You need to be able to empathize with people whom you don't know, who are not close people. But you cannot be a good scholar without criticism. You need also some kind of distance and criticism. How do you balance the closeness and distance and sympathy and criticism is very tricky, is a very tricky business. But you have to do it. Otherwise, if you just embrace the people you study or the religions you study, you don't have the critical distance that permits you to see what went wrong when. Because in all cultures, in all religions, in history, things go wrong more easily than they go right. And the role of the scholar is to find out what happens. Not only, I mean, comparative religion is not interfaith. Interfaith means that you meet people of different faiths and you say, we all believe in the same God, we all are nice people, and so on and so on. It's much better than killing one another. But the scholar of religion is interested also, and maybe mainly, in the differences between religions. Where is it that the concept of love in Islam, for instance, is different from the concept of love in Christianity? And it is different. And so on and so forth, of Buddhism, of Judaism, love, and any other concept. So in a sense, we have to be very critical, and I'm afraid that the scholarship of Islam today, most people cannot do two things at once, being critical and being sympathetic. So some choose to do that. Some, it's very difficult, but I think that we've moved beyond what Said pointed out, very important problems. I think we've moved beyond them. There are other problems. Which one are they? I don't know. I'm searching.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Struenze. I mean, it's been a
It was
pleasure.
my pleasure.
Oh, yeah, it's our pleasure discussing your fascinating research, and we deeply appreciate your invaluable contributions to the field of comparative religion. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Real Talk podcast, and be sure to check out Professor Struenze's books, A New Science, The Discovery of Religion in the Age of Reason, and the Idea of Semitic Monotheism. Struenze has a long list of many other books that has published. One of them we spoke about on this podcast already. And yeah, so please go check out his catalog, because as many of you know, these podcasts do not do justice to the work of the guests that we bring on. And again, Professor Struenze, thank you for joining us today. And can you just speak a little bit about your upcoming book on the topic of monotheism, to kind of give our audience members something to look forward to?
Not really, but I would want to write a book in a different key from the books I've written until now. I'm getting older, and I would want not to write an autobiography. I don't think that my autobiography is so interesting, but I want to reflect on how I've seen through, let's say, half a century, through the 1970s, yes, more than half a century, how I've seen the history of religions develop. And I would call it maybe history of religions. I would call it 3D history of religions in three dimensions. A, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, on which I've devoted most of my interest. B, in three languages. I've taught mostly in Hebrew, but I've written mostly in English, but I think mostly in French. So it's also three cultures, not only three languages, but three different cultures and three continents. I did my BA in Israel, I did my PhD in the United States, and I'm basically a European. I taught at Oxford, I grew up in Paris. So it's also three-dimensional, three continents. That's what I would want to reflect, and it will be my answer to Roxana's last question, actually. Hopefully, what it means today in different parts of the world and from different approaches. I think that's it. Not yet written.
Yeah. Well, once it comes out, I'll be definitely interested in reading it. I've read Bernard Lewis's memoirs, Notes of a Century, or being what it's like being a historian over the past century. And I find those kind of works really interesting, because you kind of get the insights of the scholar that you wouldn't get in their work. Maybe you get them on things like this podcast, but having to read them from the mind of the scholar themselves is very valuable. So.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you, Roxana. Thank you,
Thank you.
Teron, and thank you for the listeners.
All
Okay.
right. And on that
Bye-bye.
note, peace, everyone.
Peace.